basically, well, I'll focus obviously on subcontractors, but really to talk about how to set up profiles, options for profiles, options for capturing time. I also extended that a little bit to talk about capturing cost, and then the kind of reports that you could look into implementing in the system. So I've got some examples for us to discuss. And I do have a lot of material, so if I am going a little too fast, certainly I can answer questions after this, or you're free to have a copy of these slides. And then maybe listen back to the recording at a slower speed or something, because I have a lot to get through in a half an hour. All right, so let's start with just the whole concept of what is subcontractor management. We define it as the act of managing your resources that are not direct employees. So this could be subcontracting companies where you have a relationship for staff augmentation. This could be individual contractors. It could be some expertise that you're loaning out. So really a lot of it is subcontractor management. And the challenges of tracking that type of resource in OpenAir usually includes the fact that you employ a resource and they may charge you different rates for different things. So database administration versus technical writing may have a different rate. You're not really sure because you don't own the resource. You don't really know when the person's going on vacation or what their work week is like. Maybe they're a part-time resource and you don't necessarily know that because you don't own them. Do you know all of their skill sets and availability, profile availability from the vendor themselves? Like what kind of skills do they have on staff that you could leverage? And of course, those of you who do use the OpenAir system, we all know that if you set up a user account to log into the system, it uses a license. So that's a little bit of a balancing act when it comes to working with subcontractors because they may not be full-time employees or long-term employees. They may be 1-month employees, and so being able to manage the license activation along the way. And then finally, something that I'm very in tune with is limiting the visibility of you as a company, like the data that you're sharing with them. Not only things like bill rate and cost, but also just who are your customers, what types of projects do you have in play, because they're being hired to do a special activity typically. So you really want to limit what they're able to see from a system perspective. Now, when you're setting up contractors, there's really two basic approaches to giving subcontractors access to your OpenAir environment. The first is you actually set up a full user account. And when I say full user account, I don't mean like a PSA license. If any of you have like the 2-tier licensing where you have a PSA full access account and then a time and expense user only. You typically give a subcontractor a time and expense account unless you're hiring them for some kind of like project management or something. But you would be able to give them a user account just like you do your employees, and they would log in directly to OpenAir. But the other approach is giving the vendor themselves a general login. So, ABC company gets a single account and a single contact from that company logs in to record time and understand how their resources are being scheduled. The reason behind the two approaches is really what is the engagement model that you have with your subcontractor. So if you are engaging with an editorial or a QA service for your marketing campaign stuff, somebody just double checks and makes sure that everything's spelled right and the grammar is correct. It may not be an actual named person that you know who's doing the work. It's the editor team, right? So that would warrant a more generic login because it could be any one of like 25 people, whoever picks up the queue item to do the work. That's more of a team type login versus an individual user where you're hiring Jody to do OpenAir consulting. So then I need to be able to record my time. So it depends on how you engage your subcontractors would drive the need for how that you set up the accounts. And you don't have to go one way or the other. It really depends on the relationship with your vendor on whether you have to do either of these or both in your environment. Now, as you're setting up the user account, so what you want to be able to do is you want to be able to understand what what user account is an employee versus a subcontractor. So I also think there's sort of two general approaches to setting up a tagging, is what I like to call it, for user accounts. One's called a basic setup, where you just have a simple drop-down menu on the user demographic form that says it's an employee or a subcontractor or an intern or whatever. A little more advanced is using the entity tag. And the entity tag gives you more of a view of things like an employment status, because some of you may engage subcontractors and then later on they become employees. So do you necessarily have to close and open user accounts? Can you just use the same user account? And you can if you use this entity tag approach, which I'm going to show you in the system. So from a basic perspective, the basic approach works for named users and generic users. The advanced is very useful if you have individual users, because those users could become full-time employees. So if you're not familiar with the entity tag group, there it is, okay. So if I go into a user account, just to let you know. So when you enable the entity tag feature, if you're not familiar with it, it's under other optional features down here, optional features, and it's enable user tag feature option. And when you have it turned on, you'll see another thing here show up called tag groups. And these are different, they look like drop-down menus or drop-down fields, but what you do is you define the field name and you define the values that are in here, and those values can be active and inactive. So it's a nice scalable feature in the system. So I could put like an employment status or employed, and I could say the three values are you're not employed, you're an employee, or you're a subcontractor. And how this works inside the user setup is if you go into a user account, like our friend Jason here, he's now a subcontractor to us. There's this thing called the user entity tag that turns on with the user account. And when you have that, what it gives you the ability to do is say, what's their current status, and historically, what were they in the past. So you can see here that Jason was brought on board on July 7th, because that's the day before this end date, because before that he was not employed. Then he was an employee for a couple of years, and now he's in subcontractor mode. So by using this entity tag, I've basically given a date index tagging to this user account, and now on reporting, when I want to look at subcontractors, I just filter on the employed field by the value subcontractor, and all the subcontractors get pulled in. If I filter on employee, all the employees get pulled in. So that way I get sort of the best of both worlds. I can pull everyone in and segment it out. Oops. So once you have the sort of the tagging in place, then you also want to talk about the access and what they should be able to see. So I definitely recommend setting up a role just for contractors and limiting the permission sets for them. So the role of a contractor could be very, very similar to your time user or end user or employee filter set, whatever you've called it, role, whatever you've called it. But a couple of key values to look at on the role. So if I look at it like a user role, there's a few key values that I kind of highlight when we think about subcontractor access. One of them is reports. So do you give them access to modify reports? And if you do, then they have the ability potentially to try and pull a report that gives them access to more information than you desire. So you could certainly share some reports with them that you've created, but I wouldn't necessarily give them the ability to modify any reports. Other things that you may give access to for end users is maybe end users are allowed to do some slight modifications to projects. If you think in terms of what you're allowing the contractor to do you necessarily want to give that to them? Otherwise, you would just turn that off in their role. And finally, if there are other things like the view all controls in the role, things like giving people access to view all the timesheets or view all the time entries on a timesheet. Those are all things inside the role, so I would definitely turn that off so they're really just viewing the things that they're allowed to see based on their filter set. Okay. So speaking of filter sets, that's the other thing that I would recommend you set up. So many of you probably have a filter set. It's quite often called booked assigned, and it's the type of filter set that's a self-view filter set. You should definitely have that type of filter set in place for your subcontractor, where they're only allowed to see themselves and they're only allowed to see projects that they're booked or assigned to. If you don't have a filter set like that, I would certainly create one. If you go to filter sets, like I set up this contractor one, and this contractor one has a very limited view. They can only see myself, and they can only see projects that they're booked or assigned to. Then, of course, depending on what your configuration is all about, you may want to limit what project stages they can see, maybe what time types or booking types they can see, depending on how much you want them to explore in the system, and then being able to lock down what they're allowed to see. So if they could see, booking types that were like planning or soft booking for pipeline stuff, that would give them access to see that pipeline project, which is not necessarily something you may consider doing. And also, if you give people access to modify certain forms as a contractor, you may want to also consider locking down certain fields just for that role, because they should not necessarily see and make changes to certain fields that your employees might change. The one thing I want you to be aware of, however, is there's a nice feature from an administration perspective that deals with assignment groups. And as I talked about the filter set, you can give people access to projects that they're booked and assigned to, which is a nice feature because then I can just control what they see. However, in many cases, you may have your assignment group feature set up that allows you to automatically add any new user into an assignment group. And this assignment group is typically called like all employees or all staff. And that is the assignment group that's assigned to things like time off and administration projects, which your contractors don't necessarily need access to. So if you do happen to have this feature turned on, remember the fact that you set up a subcontractor, this feature is going to pop them into the employee assignment group, and they'll automatically have access to your internal jobs, which you don't necessarily want them to do. So just a caution of using this feature when it comes to subcontractors. You can always go and remove them back out of the assignment group manually. So it's more of a 80-20 rule, which is the easiest way. Add them in or take them out. Now, with the skill profile feature that's in the system, subcontractors can actually be set up to have a skill profile just like your employees can. You can have, if they have a regular user account, you can go ahead and have them fill in a skill profile. Keep in mind GDPR and any kind of relationship you have with the vendor that prevents or limits you from the type of information you can store in your systems about your subcontractors. But if they do have a login to the system, of course, they could use the resource profile feature to add profiles. And if you're not familiar with that feature, that's over here in the resources module. And the one that we have activated right now is the consolidated profile. So it has basic information about the individual, and they can set up their skill, experience, and profile here for searching. Okay. Now, if you have decided to give people access as a single vendor account, single user account, so ABC Company login, you can actually also set up generic users. So that vendor could be given access to set up generic users that represent their employees or types of employees and set up a profile against them. So generic users are users that are used for scheduling and planning, but they can have a profile. They do respect the entity tag set up as well. Generic users just can't have actual time or actual expenses. So I would certainly leverage them quite often in the world of the subcontractor setup because it does give you flexibility to track actual named people. And if you're not familiar with how the search function works, this is one of the newer search functions. I think it came out in the October release last year. So if you do have subcontractor user accounts or are using generics, keep in mind that you do have the ability to bring in inactive resources in your search, because that could be a subcontractor account that you've turned off. You could bring in generics, and then both of these types of objects have entity tag feature searches on these as well. So this is the advanced resource search that's underneath the search module inside the resources module when you're looking for resources to schedule. Now, from a cost perspective, there's really three basic approaches for cost management in OpenAir for subcontractors. The first, which is a very, very basic one, is using expense items. And that's if you have more of a fixed fee type vendor relationship. So it's not a substitution for timesheets at all. It's just a way to quickly capture expenses of fixed fee vendors if they're not required to put time in. Another, though, is there's a whole vendor purchase order process in OpenAir. There's a quick PO process in OpenAir. And then finally, of course, timesheets being entered directly by the subcontractor. You can actually opt to use any of these, a combination of these, one or two or all three. But the more that you use, the more you also have to pay attention to how you set up your reports, especially when you're bringing cost in, so like margin reporting, forecasting, things like that. You certainly don't want to double count cost. So depending on the mixture of the approaches, you will have to accommodate that in your report setup. Okay. But I'm going to focus on the timesheet aspect of this. So from a timesheet perspective, people, subcontractors are often encouraged just to enter time directly into OpenAir. So they're limited to the projects they can see, just like probably many of your employees, by what they're scheduled to work on or what tasks they've been assigned. You can actually control whether they get late timesheet alerts or not. I'm going to show you that on the next slide, the configuration options there if you haven't noticed those. And there's a time entry reconcile feature that allows you to reconcile the hours that are coming in on the vendor invoices with the hours that they've recorded in OpenAir, because you certainly want to make sure those match so you're not paying them a different amount than what you're getting as far as the billable hours back to a client, for example. Okay. So if you look at the timesheet alert, if you weren't aware of it, there's a late timesheet alert in OpenAir, and it comes with these controls on them as far as the rules. So you can send the alert to all users, of course, and that would include all the subcontractors that are active. But really, when you're engaging a subcontractor, if they're not full-time, they may only be scheduled 1 or 2 weeks at a time. And what I like about this is it gives you the controls to be able to say only send out the alerts if there's someone with a current task assignment or a current booking, depending on how you're doing your resource scheduling in the system. So you can actually have a separate timesheet alert just for subcontractors. So you're filtering on those subcontractors, and then you're using this users with current booking, for example, and then they would be able to get alert if they're supposed to have done work that week and the timesheet's still missing. Okay. You don't have to set up the system with one timesheet alert. You certainly can use these filters and these checkbox options to set up multiple types of alerts so that they fit the needs of the types of people that you need to notify. Okay. And one of my early favorite features in using OpenAir when this came out is this time entry in reconciliation feature. So if you don't have this time entry tab showing up in your system, it could be either A, the feature's not turned on, which is an internal switch called Enable Time Entry tab, or B, your role does not have permission to see this. So I would contact your administrator and see if they could enable it for you to see. It's very handy. In addition to what I'm going to tell you about the reconcile, it really just breaks down all the time entries into individual time entries. So it's easier than running a report because it's very much like a filtering type thing. But if you want to use the reconcile feature, there's a couple of custom fields that you set up, and you can find this all in the Suite Answers or email us. There's a couple of custom fields you set up on the time entry itself, and when you're in the time entry tab, you get a checkbox option. So without those fields, you don't get the checkbox option. But once you get the checkbox option, what you have the ability to do is use the Run in Action feature to set a reconcile or a paid or a invoice status dropdown that you define, and also set a notes field. So even in this screen, this example here, we're keeping track of the subcontractor's time entries, and we're noting that payment out for time entered is effective as of July 30th. So July 31st and onward, that time has not yet been submitted as an invoice from the vendor, and we haven't paid it out yet. So there's no notes about payment. Okay. So it's a nice little kind of tracking feature. Gives your project managers the ability to know what's going on with the back office and accounting. It also gives accounting a sort of a checksum ability to make sure that things match with the invoices. If you haven't seen that in the system, let me just show you that. So if you go into the timesheet module in the time entries tab, there's the two custom fields that you set up. We call them reconciled and notes, but if you use these checkboxes and run an action, you get the option to set the status to one value and then the notes to whatever you'd like. So it's really like we've defined a process to be able to support that nicely. And then regarding the cost of that time, usually there's a cost on the user record. But if we're using sort of the general account, how do we vary for the fact that the subcontractor could change rates based on the different projects they work on? So there is a project level cost override feature that you can enable, and there's even a task level version of that as well. If you're looking at the reporting options in OpenAir, things like timesheet, all hours cost, there's usually two cost reporting values, one called current and one called actual. Current always means the cost of the user on the user account, that cost tab on the user account. Actual always means the task level, or if that's blank, the project level, or if that's blank, it defaults to mean the same thing as the user level account. So it does give you the ability to have sort of a cross-charge intercompany, use it for intercompany revenue type reporting in addition to tracking the uniqueness of subcontractor costs. Okay. And these overrides are all available for all three levels of cost. If you weren't aware of it, you can actually track more than one cost level on a user. You can do up to three, and the overrides are available to all three levels as well. Okay. So from a reporting perspective, what should you give vendors in your OpenAir system? You shouldn't obviously share all kinds of utilization and stuff within the organization because they're subcontractors. But oftentimes what you want to give them is you want to give them a report or visibility or a graph of what is the schedule that's being requested of them across the vendor resources if you have multiple user accounts for them. So giving them a view of how their team is being requested or staffed in your OpenAir environment. Also give them the ability to run reports for time, because usually the person who's like running reports in your OpenAir environment may be a vendor manager within the vendor system, so they're wanting to pull all that time so they can make sure it matches their system, because their system is what's going to generate the invoice to you. So if you share the vendor information with the vendor, then they'll be able to make sure that their invoices are also accurate. Okay. When you have a vendor that has 3, 4, 5, 6 different user accounts in your OpenAir system, you may want to consider setting up just a filter set for them so that any one of those vendor resources could run a report on behalf of the entire vendor company and pull all the time for all the resources that are part of that same company or a vendor contact that has access to those reports. So just a little kind of like a vendor service that you could provide. But more importantly, what dashboards should you be pulling and reports should you be pulling when you manage subcontractors? So last week I talked about, some people want to include subcontractors into utilization. I'm not a big fan of that unless they're really a staff augmentation, a full-time subcontractor. Then it makes sense to bring them into utilization because you're treating them as an employee. But really you want to be able to understand when you're scheduling them, because scheduling a vendor means you're scheduling cost, out-of-pocket, money out the door cost. And that's something that is very much something to keep an eye on, is what's the cost of the, what's the money outflow to the vendors to be able to support the delivery of the projects that you're doing. Okay. You'll also want to make sure there's timesheet compliance metrics in place, and even making sure that you're getting the invoices from the vendors. So that reconcile feature I showed you, you can certainly have reports set up for that. And then the cost example I have here is something that I was kind of playing with the other day, thinking I think this is a nice metric to look at is, for the services that I'm delivering in my organization, what's the cost of my internal resources and what's the cost of my external resources. And I did this one as a totals, but you could do more like an average cost rate or an average return on investment. Because if you complement that with, so how many hours am I getting from a subcontractor, and what's that percentage ratio type thing, you can see very quickly if the hours that you get from your subcontractors are higher or lower value than your employees. Subcontractors for many companies are more expensive than their own resources, but depending on where you source those resources from, you could get a cost break if you engage a whole team, and sometimes those subcontractors can be cheaper than your employees. And this kind of metric gives you some visibility into, am I getting a better return on investment the more subcontractors I use? The downside of that, of course, is your knowledge is with the subcontractor, and you as a company need to build based on your resources because they're one of your key assets in professional services. So it's a little bit of a balance game. Bottom line doesn't necessarily say you always go with subcontractors because that knowledge level or that experience really pays off also. So there's another set of metrics that I'm sure you could cover with that, but looking at it from what OpenAir can provide, knowing how much time, how much resources you're using from the vendor account, and kind of factoring that into how effective are you as a PS organization in delivery. Right. So as we tie it all together, and then I'll open up the phone lines, we all know subcontractors are resources that you bring on board because they're filling a gap in your organization. They complement your skill sets, or there's a unique need that you have. You do have a lot of options as far as cost management for those subcontractors. You certainly should measure the cost that you're spending on subcontractors. Keep an eye on that to make sure you're getting a good return on investment and you're not letting the knowledge walk out the door. That knowledge can be complemented with skill profiles, so you know what kind of skills you're engaging in on a regular basis. And then those types of resources could be potentially new hires that you're looking for because you're having to pull subcontractors for certain skills all the time, right? And on top of everything else, really, your OpenAir administrator should be your buddy in all this to make sure that we have a good vendor management and onboarding process and offboarding process, so terminating user licenses where necessary so that you can keep that license count under control with OpenAir.